Okay, welcome back, everyone. Welcome to those who are in the live Zoom room with us and also to those following on the YouTube live streaming. We are now in our final month of the final semester of Core Enaction. So this is session 6 of our 8 sessions a semester, where we're really examining participatory sense-making through various domains of practice and also looking at the ways in which certain domains of practice inform our understanding of participatory sense-making and more broadly enactive ethics. So this session will be taking up in a very large way all things around pedagogy, but not necessarily in the classical sense, as you'll see from our two invited guest speakers. We'll be looking much more broadly at questions of transmission and transformation, and what does that mean? And maybe what does that even mean in ways that we don't fully yet understand? So I think we will, without further ado, get started. But I'm wondering, Letitia, would you like for us just to have a moment of just grounding before we introduce our guest speakers? Okay.
Yes, please, Johanna.
So maybe just as usual, as is custom, you all know by now. So maybe just take a moment, whatever feels kind of helpful for you. Some of you may be at the end of your day. Some people may be at the beginning of their day. Some people may be right in the middle of their day on their lunch break. Maybe just take a moment to get comfortable in your seat. Feel whatever surface your body is in contact with. So that might be the chair, might be the floor, might feel your back, your legs, your feet. And maybe I'd invite you just to consider your back body, because we tend to be so focused frontally in our culture, looking at screens and faces and having conversations and answering emails, and we're very frontally focused. So what would it feel like to relax back into the back of the body? And maybe what other forms of awareness are available when we're not so frontally focused, but maybe focused more on what's behind us, around us. Maybe that allows for a certain form of receptivity. Okay, and when you're ready, maybe still keeping the sensation with you tonight of the awareness of what's all around you, maybe behind you, what it feels like to relax back into the back of your body. We can open up the front of ourselves, maybe open up the eyes, and then take in the interactions that we're about to embark on from that place of awareness. So, Letitia, I'm happy to pass it to you now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Johanna, for this practice, this grounding practice. And welcome, everyone. It's nice to see you all. So I'm very happy today to be with Joelle Aden and Erin Manning here for this discussion about transmission, teaching, learning. And so I will introduce our speakers, our invited speakers today. So Erin Manning studies in the interstices of philosophy, aesthetics, and politics, concerned always about author-pedagogical and author-economic practices. Pedagogical experiments are central to her work, some of which occur at Concordia University in Montreal, where she is a researcher chair in speculative pragmatism, art, and pedagogy in the Faculty of Fine Arts. Recent monographs include The Minor Gesture, 2016, For a Pragmatics of Useless, 2020, and Out of the Clear, 2022. Her artwork is textile-based and relationally oriented, often participatory. She's interested in the detail of material complexity, in what reveals itself to perception sideways, in the quality of a textural engagement with life. Her work often plays synesthetically with touch, of recent acknowledgement and experimentation with the pro-tactile movement for deaf-blind culture and language. Tactile propositions include large-scale hangings produced with a diversity of tools, including tufting, hooking, knotting, weaving. 3E is the main direction her current research takes, an exploration of the transversality of the three ecologies: the social, the environmental, and the conceptual. An iteration of 3E is a land-based project north of Montreal where living and learning is experimented. Legacies of Sense Lab infuse the project, particularly the question of how collectively is crafted in a more than human encounter with worlds in the making. So, Erin, thanks very much for being with us tonight or this afternoon. And I'm very glad and looking forward to the discussion. And I will introduce our another invited speaker, Joelle Aden. So Joelle is a full professor at the Social Science and Humanities Department of Paris Créteil Université. She set up the Enact research team in 2019. Her research, in line with the enactive paradigm, focuses on renewing the mutual inquiry between the arts and the sciences in education. She investigates the notion of translanguaging as the dynamic act of connecting with oneself, with others, and with one's environment, through which shared meanings continuously emerge between human beings. She explores a transdisciplinary methodology that engages corporeality and emotions in the training of teachers and artists. With her team, she experiments with a cognitive framework of reference inspired by the living world. So Joelle, thanks very much for accepting our invitation, for being here with us tonight. And so I will start this conversation reminding us all of the guiding questions of this semester that is around the participatory sense-making framework. And as usual, we have two guiding questions, two big, gigantic, actually, questions, but I would like to share them with you again. And the first one is, just tell us something about intersubjective expertise in your practice. So as we are discussing through this semester in the past sessions, and we are learning and maybe transmitting this idea that the participatory sense-making theory have this starting point that everyone has intersubjective expertise by the virtue of being human. So, and each of you, our invited speakers, have a particular intersubjective expertise in your work, in your practice as professors, artists, researchers, and so on. So we'd like to invite you to speak about your practices or your work in terms of this subjective expertise that is already there, that you already see in it, and you know to be there. And also, if possible, to bring also some questions about intersubjective expertise as they manifest in their daily practice. What do you still wonder about? Is there any opening to improve? Are there areas of friction or tension, of quest? And our second big question, the second big set of questions is, what is at stake for you as a practitioner? This can be on the meta level, so at the level of the methodology, such as what does it mean to do a participatory research, or directly in the practice, the concrete practices in a daily basis. What matters to you? What is at stake for you as professor, artist, researcher, as you engage and interact with others, colleagues, students, collaborators, institutions? So these are the two main questions that we have, and I would like to invite you to start a conversation about them. So Joelle, we'll start talking about your work, and thanks again.
Thank you, Letitia. Well, so many big questions. So first of all, thank you very much for inviting me, for giving me the opportunity to meet Erin, to meet all the participants this morning, afternoon, or I don't know. Yes, I think I'll start with explaining what I do, actually. I think this is the easiest way. As you mentioned just in the presentation, for over 20 years now, I've been teaching language through the arts, right? And also research methodology at the University Paris-Est, but more precisely at the Teacher Training Institute, right? So the first thing I like to say, because you were talking of friction, for example, the first thing I need to say is that it is fairly difficult. It is even an act of resistance to implement an active pedagogical approach in our domain. And there are several reasons. I cannot mention all the reasons, but the frictions, if I may start with the friction, is maybe that to begin with, the enactive epistemology, when I speak about it, when I make proposals, in my university, is that it challenges the very principles of bankable education, right? So this is the first thing people say, well, that is interesting, that is really nice, but we don't need this, really. I mean, I find this difficult this is the first reason. Then the second one is that in France, at least, our education system, especially because I teach teachers, I train teachers, our education system in France is dominated by a cognitive, evidence-based approach to education. And I'll give an example right now. Last year, we got recommendation from the ministry that our research in education should be based on research in the field of medicine, right? Which means that, well, it questions the validity of qualitative research and first-person research. So this makes an inactive approach in research fairly difficult. There's a second reason. And also the third reason is, well, I don't know if it is the same elsewhere, but teaching here is really disconnected with the felt and the poetic dimension of life. Even though we are asked to teach, for example, we are asked to teach empathy, but it is as if teachers would have to give empathic classes, like if empathy was a subject, you know what I mean? So we are really led to defend our ideas, and this is not easy. So this is the first friction that I encounter in my daily basis, right? And if I may, I don't know, but I'd like to share how this project I'm going to present, how it began. So it began a long time ago. It was more than 10 years ago. We were a group of about 15, 16 researchers, artists, doing research, action research in schools, at university, and we had artistic projects. And then by, meeting fairly often and writing reports and all that, we finally decided after a few years that things had to change and that we had to take action, right? So this first group of about 15 people, we opted for an enactive training program. We decided we would try at least to implement this training program in France. And this program, we would not only invite teachers, but we would make it transdisciplinary, right? With teachers, obviously, trainers, researchers, artists. And because we were working with artists and because we were into the arts, it was obvious for us that we would, the opening door would be the arts, right? So we chose to, it was quite a discussion, but we decided we would try to open a master's degree. And why a master's degree? Because, a master's degree is it would make us work inside the system, right? And we were not sure we wanted to be inside the system. And Erin will know what I mean. And in the end, we decided we would stay inside the system to disseminate the ethics of Enaction within the system itself. And also a master's degree. Some artists disagreed with that, and some others said, yes, we need to have a master's degree because as artists, we would feel empowered with having a degree. So, all this took a few years. And then after some time, you mentioned it before, in 2019, we felt ready and we did two things. First of all, we set up this research group, which we called Langue Enact, which langue means language. In France, we have two words for language. We have langue and langage, but I'm not going to explain this. And obviously enact for enaction, but we chose the verb, right? Because we thought the verb was more dynamic. So Langue Enact. So we set up this team. We enrolled doctoral students to work with us on doctoral projects. And then we opened our master's degree, and we called it Art Enact, which is a play on words. Art Enact, enact for enaction, to enact, and art is the arts, obviously, but it's also ART, like the circularity between the artists, the researchers, and the teachers. We don't use the word transmission, but I can explain why later. And we borrow this acronym from our friends at UBC, British Columbia in Vancouver, who have developed this orthography methodology in research. Maybe you know about orthography, Erin? So yeah, so we were inspired by this idea of circularity between all those expertise, and we decided we would do that. So what we did at the beginning, it was like we created things as we were walking, right? We called it Enacting Enaction. I know that there's an article by Michel Bidbol, and I think Sébastien Voros, which is entitled Enacting Enaction, I think. But when I saw the article, I said, oh, this is what we're doing, actually. But this is a program, but this is not a program. In itself, it is more, we call it an incubator, that's a research lab, a laboratory. It's kind of a third space inside university for a tiny group of students, because we have like between 14, 16, 18 students every year. And they are all professionals, right? Sometimes they may be, as I said, artists, philosophers. Some of them have their PhD in science, in mathematics, in language, whatever. Others are simply primary teachers, for example. And this was one of the difficulty we met when we wanted to open this, because we were told, well, this is silly. How can you imagine a program for teaching a primary teacher with a PhD student and an artist? But people, our colleagues didn't see the logic of this. But anyway, so this is it. And in this program, each student actually contributes, shares. This is where the what you said, the intersubjective. Everything in this program is intersubjective. Every single thing we do is intersubjective. So the students, they contribute, they share their professional expertise, and also they conduct. I mean, so that we have this group, for a year approximately, and inside this year they form groups of two or threes, and they conduct an experiment throughout the year, using the enactive approach. And they obviously, we help them. I mean, there is a collaboration, there is intersubjectivity between I don't like to call us trainers. We don't say we are the trainers or the teachers. We call ourselves facilitators in the master's degree, because we are more like colleagues indeed. So they conduct an experiment. So we have now a number, maybe 20, 30, small, research projects which have been carried out, and which are very interesting, because each of these projects is based on an enactive approach through the arts. And we ask them to work on a neurophenomenological hypothesis. So I can explain this later, because it's a little bit too much for the beginning. And the last thing I'd like to say about this project, it is, and you mentioned it, and thank you for mentioning it, we work on a cognitive framework, which was inspired by Francisco Varela, actually. I don't know if I ever said it before, but it goes back at the end of the 90s, when I met Hélène Trocmé-Fab. She's an educational researcher and a linguist. And when I met her, it was 1990, I don't know, 6 or 7. And she had just published a series of interviews with scientists in France, to whom she had asked the same question, maybe 5 or 6 scientists. The question was to them, what does science tell us about the act of learning, right? And Francisco Varela was interviewed, and he has 2 documentary films. One of them, the first one, is entitled "Born to Organize Complexity." So this is very interesting. At that time, it was the first time for me, at least, that we had like a scientist, Francisco Varela himself, giving us, clues or hints to know what to do. This was really fantastic for us. So the second one was entitled "Born to Create Meaning." So participatory sense making is exactly, in this idea that we are born to act together, to love each other. That's what Francisco Varela said as well, maybe not in the videos, but and then to create meaning together. And 5 years after this, publishing these videos, Hélène Trocmé, she published what she called a cognitive framework that we translated 2 years ago in English, right? And it is free to download on the internet. It is called The Art of Learning and the Knowledge Tree, right? And this is mainly based on an enactive proposition. To my knowledge, This was, I mean, in France, the very first time we had someone who would offer this, this opportunity of using a cognitive framework based not on competences and skills, or I don't know, but based on the logic of the living. Where do we start when we learn something? We start with affect, with connecting to the environment. And how do we go up the trees, which, in the end, it's like a circular way of working. And if you teach a history or whatever, then you can use the tree, this framework, but then you have to, you have to make your own work on this framework. So I think we are testing this. We've been testing this since a long time, but in this program, this is the very first opportunity that we have to test the tree, right? And the top of the tree to finish for this first part is really a participatory sense making, because Ellen, when she says we go up the tree and then we have to innovate, to create, and so on, but at the top, the main the most important skill or competence that you need to have is to create or build something together, right? So that to create meaning together. So this is the top of the tree. So I remember when I started talking about the tree, people would say to me, but this is crazy, because communication is the basis. You need to be able to communicate first, and then, you can create. And we said no, because we create as we are walking. But so this is it. So we are using this framework, and we are expanding, we are developing things around the tree. And Hélène, she's still alive, and she said to us lately, you have to work on the roots of the trees. So, wow. Maybe I'll stop here to begin with, if this is...
Thank you so much, Joelle, for this fascinating introduction to our conversation. I will pass to you, Erin.
Yeah, thank you so much, Joelle. What a beautiful project, and so many extraordinary questions. I have so many different directions a response to these questions could take. I'm looking at them again. So intersubjective expertise and areas of tension, and what is at stake for me as a practitioner. What does it mean to do participatory research? And what is at stake in interaction with others? So they're very daily questions for me. I work daily in more than one environment. I work as an artist. I work as a professor, and I work in the 3 Ecologies project, which I can talk more about. But maybe in order to complement what Joelle has said, I'll trouble the question a little bit, and we can have a conversation about the trouble. And it will only be interesting if we can keep troubling it, because I don't really want to, give a lecture. So over the last 20 or so years, I've worked deeply in the area of neurodiversity, and I know that you've engaged with that question at other times. One of the most interesting things about neurodiversity and autistics in particular, and even more specifically, what I call classical autistics, so folks who don't have the motor ability to speak with their own voices, who use other modes of communication to be in conversation, is that they speak across the board about the difficulty of knowing where their body ends and the world begins. And I've written about this. And I've often also talked about, in another context, the question of the child. So the child falls on the ground, and when the parent says, "Where does it hurt?" the child points at the earth. So these two moments where we have a really strong sense that the idea of the subject or of the human is delimited in abstraction. So we learn it. We learn this abstraction of separation between ourselves and the world. So that's on the one hand, something that I've been very interested about. What I've also been really interested about in maybe more so over the last decade or so are the writings of people like Sylvia Wynter, many others, who are really troubling the idea of the human in relation to Blackness. So who talk about the question of colonization and the ways in which the human as category is produced by colonization, and that the Black body, as an example, is excluded from it. So when I hear intersubjective, I hear a problem. And I don't mean this in any way critically to any person. I just know that often intersubjective sidles whiteness. It's a particular way of not paying attention to the question itself of the subject, who gets to claim that. Under what conditions can we call what we do subjective? And by that, I don't mean that I don't understand the project. Of course, I understand the project, and I'm not blaming anyone. I'm just saying maybe there's a moment for us to talk about what we mean by intersubjective. In my own vocabulary, I've opted more so for a vocabulary of relation, where relation is not the intersubjective. In fact, it's exactly not. It's sort of in the opposite of it, that relation is the world, and that a kind of production of subjectivity is born of it, perhaps in the way that Félix Guattari would talk about it, or in the associated milieu, as Gilbert Simondon might talk about it. And it is there that I'm interested in the pedagogical and what I call para-pedagogies of resistance. But again, I am deeply in disagreement with any tendency to cancel each other, to police each other, to weaponize language. This is not about that at all. It's really perhaps an opportunity for us to sit with, sort of late in your course, to sit with the ways in which we white people might inadvertently exclude a complexity of engagement. And I'm not here assuming everyone's white. I'm just speaking myself as somebody with white skin who has been really interested in these questions. And also, though I don't talk about it very often, and because I don't think it's so interesting, about my own neurodiversity and the ways in which, as Joelle said, the pedagogical environment is poised to destroy us. And the final thing that I would say is that it's perhaps important to understand in the context of how I think, that I don't think neurotypicality is a person. I don't think there is such a thing. Neurotypicality is a mode. The pedagogical institutions that we move through police it and produce it. It is produced also in the family, when we, for example, train a child to be still, to be attentive, to be frontal, to pay attention, we do it all the time. And so neurodiversity is a complexity that plays itself out in many, many different ways. And I have no interest in generalizing it. What I'm interested in is thinking systemically. How do our pedagogical systems produce the requirements of body and knowledge that replay neurotypicality? And so if you understand neurotypicality that way, then you might also understand how, for me, neurotypicality is always in conversation with whiteness. So similarly, whiteness is not reducible to a white person, not interested in reducing it to colonial definitions of race. But I am interested in talking about how whiteness is in conduit with certain forms of privilege that include white skin. So perhaps that's enough to begin with.
Thanks, Erin. Thanks so much for these elements that you brought, because it's a very interesting this reversion of the question of intersubjectivity. And also this idea, I don't know if I'm right in understanding it that in that way, but there is much more in unlearning things than necessarily learning or acquiring new knowledges. There is an exercise of unlearning certain things that are transmitting to institutions, in the broad sense of the term institutions. So I was wondering, Joelle, because with this idea of unlearning, I was wondering if it is related to your refusal in using the word transmission or transmitting something and not being seen as a trainer, but as a facilitator.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Erin. This is great because in the in the university we work, the students, the teachers, we are a multicultural population, right? And so when we started the first and second year, we were aware of what you're saying, but we were not, I mean, we didn't touch, concretely the thing. Then when our students or colleagues started doing their research projects, they opened up the question of, well, precisely of decolonizing the body, decolonizing everything. And we had, for example, those projects of young colleagues working who refused to work to do their project in schools, for example, because they said they wanted to create communication between teachers, young children, parents, and educators. And they said, if we do anything, any project inside the Constitution, we won't reach any point because there's no point doing this. So they started, working in friche. I don't know what you say in English for friche. I mean, like third spaces, some queer, very strange places. Some others, they worked with very young children and their families in nurseries. And we discovered progressively all the things you're saying. We discovered that even though we were working in this master's degree inside the university, all our students, they suddenly decided they would work outside the institutions. So they went to charities, for example. And also another tendency that they started was, instead of doing their inactive, research or an active training program with a group of people, they included everyone. I mean, the parents, the teachers, the children, the grandparents, the mayor of the town. I mean, everyone. So at the beginning, we were like lost, and then we started understanding that they were right, and that we needed to decolonize the institution. But as I said before, we produce research, but well, sometimes it raises some, contradiction, or people saying what you're doing is not interesting because we need to work inside the institution. You are inside the institution. So I think what you're saying is very interesting, Erin, and also, well, neurodiversity, because we work with a neuroscientist. We have a colleague of ours who is a neuroscientist, and this is a constant discussion with her, right? The research that is done is with white people, very rarely. Well, they have to be right-handed, and that's it. And they don't wear glasses, but nothing is done to take into account those other people. And so I understand, and this is we have to do it. It takes time. It takes time. So decolonizing the body as well. I mean, with the dancers. This is with dance that we work on this very much. So, I mean, even myself, I would never have imagined that my body was a white body before I started working with different dancers, you know. And again, this shows that you need to experience things if you want to not only understand intellectually, but if you need to live things in your body, right? Sense it. Yeah.
Thank you. Johanna, do you have a question? I have one person that...
It was just a really brief follow-up, actually, and Joelle, you started to offer a response to it in some sense. I'm really curious about this question. I think you both sort of started touching on it about ways of perhaps disrupting or subverting precisely what you're talking about, some of these neuronormative claims on the mind and body that show up very much in the environments of learning, specifically university environments, but it can also be artistic environments. It can be, you know, family environments. But I'm just wondering how you would start to work your way into that question. I mean, Joelle, you were just talking about the importance of you really have to experience it in a felt sense way. And also I'm wondering how you would respond to that, Erin, because I know so much of your work touches on that in some way.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and thank you, Joelle, for what you said. I should say off the top that I don't have any belief that the academic institution can do this work. On the other hand, I don't either believe that there's some magic place in the world where it's possible. So it's not, you know, I think that we're always in this tension that, Joelle, you've spoken about so beautifully, and thank goodness work like yours exists. I go back and forth between wanting to run as far as I can in the other direction and putting my head down and doing the work in that context. And so the tension is real. In the university, so I don't think that my work has the kind of stakes that your work has, Joelle. I'm not teaching teachers. And so my environment is perhaps a little bit less watched. I maybe a little bit. You know, I'm a philosopher and an artist. So I work across studio art environments and a dancer, right? So I work in that environment. I would never, ever have been hired in a philosophy department. They keep people like far away as they can. And so there are advantages, I think, to being a little bit more in the undercurrents. What I've done in the university over, I don't know how long, at least the last 15 years or longer, is I've always made my classes open. And what that has meant is that you can join. It used to be on Skype. Now it's on Zoom. You can come. It doesn't matter if you're taking it for accreditation. There's no limit. So I've had children in my classes. I've had families. I've had people from the street who were homeless. I've had just many people over the years. And I've always made it clear that the classroom is a refuge. There is no adjudication or evaluation in my classroom. I pay a high price for this, but I can manage it. I have status in the university, and you know, when people are not being evaluated in the normative ways in response to neurotypical modes, they just do fantastic work. So it's not like I'm, you know, giving anybody, you know, some kind of strange free pass. Everybody who's there wants to be there, and they're learning and they're doing amazing work. And over years, I've reinvented ways of doing this. I've never repeated a class. I've always staged experiments. Some of them have failed terribly, but we've always learned. So the classroom has taught me how to be in a kind of para-pedagogy, in the sense that it's taught me how I was trained to be a police of knowledge. And I think it's better if we recognize that as teachers, we have been taught to be suspicious of our students, suspicious that they're not doing their work, or suspicious that they're not listening to us, or suspicious that they're not learning. And I have to admit that it's always the case at some point in my teaching where I have conversations in my head about wanting to punish someone, but I don't do it. I try to learn from my own fears that I'm not doing my job, right? Which usually means that I'm not punishing someone. So I learned from there, and it is that work that has taught me or prepared me to the work of the Three Ecologies Project, which has no space that looks like a classroom. I really, with my partner Brian Masumi, feel that we are learning to not separate out living and learning. That's not to say that there's a general approach. It's going to be very, very different if we're collaborating with folks who are deaf-blind, to folks who are autistic, to folks who are philosophers or artists. You know, every environment requires its own very singular practices. And so I think of my work, perhaps to finish, in relation to disturbing and reorienting techniques as learning through practice. And I suppose that the thing I try to do the most is not give in to normative logics, which is to say, and I don't mean that I manage this all the time, but what I try to do is to understand which logics organize our bodies and our ways of understanding knowledge. And I try not to fight those head on, because I understand that if I fight those, and sometimes I want to, for sure, I stay in the logic of neurotypicality and in the logic of the institutions. And so Joelle said something earlier, which I feel very strongly. It's the university will always try to bring us back into its logic. And it's incredibly difficult not to. And I think it's in some places impossible not to. So for example, if I'm in the place of adjudicating a doctorate, I am in the logic of the university. And so I have to then train students to be in what we call a logic of strategic duplicity. There are times in capital where we have to be in strategic duplicity, and that will be painful. And that's a big, big, big question. So maybe I'll leave it there.
Yeah. May I? Or yeah. Well, Erin, this is I mean, I agree so much with you, and what you've just said, it is painful when you need to be in between, you know, the institution and the values you want to defend. So I think that many teachers, even young teachers who are just starting to become teachers, are in terrible suffering. So much so that I mean, very few students now are, you know, enrolling to become teachers. We miss an incredible number of teachers, and I understand why, because this is really, I mean, there is much suffering on the side of the parents, suffering as well. The children, the they suffer a lot as well. So I don't know, we try to, what we do, the first thing we do in our program is to sort of decolonize the mind of the teachers, whether they whether they are, you know, typical or not non-typical, because they are all suffering, first of all. So what we need to do is just to change perspective. We say we change their point of feeling. Like this is what's his name, Alain Berthoz, who speak of changing one's perspective or point of feeling. He says, like, you start just calm down, say it's not a problem. When they start, they say we're going to be evaluated. So we say, well, we use Hélène Trocmé idea of evaluation. She says, just remember that in to evaluate in Latin means to know if you are going all right, if everything is all right. So the thing is, if you evaluate where you are today, what you've learned, what after this session, right? Whether it be an artistic session or another kind of work. I mean, when we stop, the first question we ask ourselves, the group and each of us is, how do we feel, first of all? What are we going to remember from this session? What are we going to take to our daily life, and so on and so forth? So we're trying to change the perspective of these people. Even the artists, they are very stressed all the time, right? So this is the very first thing we do. So I understand perfectly what you say when you say to deal with pain. And prepare the normative logics. I don't know. This is interesting because before we started this program, we had this question: are we going to do it like something inside the system or outside? And now we've had this session, this program for 6 years, and we're starting to question, what are we going, do we need to stop with it? I mean, some of the artists working with us, they say, be careful if it works, like, you know, it's okay. I mean, be careful because maybe it's time you stopped. So we're asking ourselves the question, should we stop? Should we do something different? So I don't know. And this is a real question. This is a real question. You cannot be inside and outside, and and if you want to change things, well, I don't. So what we're doing, we are opening up doors. Like, for example, in our research group, we have like 2 young researchers who are starting working on what do they call it? You know, classe dehors, which is la classe dehors, which is in English would be what? Like forest schools or something like that.
Forest schools, yeah.
Yeah, trying to manage, you know, in a way, different ways, introducing things in the system, but I'm not sure. And when we're talking of what you do in the Science Lab, which I love what you're doing with the Science Lab, it made me think of this Université Populaire de Vincennes, with, you know, the Deleuze and Guattari, you know, having those classes for everyone. I mean, that was like a dream, but it was stopped by the system. And even if at Vincennes University they're trying to keep on, but I mean, it doesn't work. It doesn't work, really. And opening classes, yes, being subversive is necessary as well. Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, for me, I don't know. I mean, I have this question, you know, I've just mentioned, what do we do Do we stay in the system? Do we subvert the system, and how? And also we have some of our colleagues who are into civil disobedience at the moment, right? This is another movement that is really important, but it is not taking ground. At the moment, people are just they are like, I don't know, they don't react. They don't react simply. And I have a terrible example. Maybe I shouldn't give the example today, but that was last week. We had a message from the there's a general organization that that makes links between all the institutes of education in France. This is called Le Réseau, the network of the schools of education in France. And we got a message, an email message, saying that we were invited to attend a webinar on how to teach defense, like defense, to our students in the schools of education, so that they have a pedagogy to teach defense in their classes, primary and secondary. I started, talking to people, and nobody was reacting. They said, oh, I just threw it away. And finally, I attended the webinar because I wanted to see what it was. And that was really, freaky. There was a general of the army saying, we have to stop thinking of peace like a possible solution. We know that war is everywhere in the world, and we have to prepare the defense in our schools. You know what? And we were very few attending the webinars. So I asked, but what? And they told us that they were preparing a module that would be not obligatoire, right, for all the students in the schools of education, but we were not aware of it. And when we speak about it, people, they go, oh, this is terrible, but nobody does nothing, actually. So they even have a website which is ready with lessons ready, 30 lessons, and the last file that they I don't know who does it, by the way. There are people, who does it. And the last file is entitled, and I'm not joking, this is true, on the website, which is Education and Defense. It's called Literature, Art, and the War, right? And what I find very terribly, I don't know, unexplainable, right, is that nobody reacts. Because people that throw away the messages, because people say, oh, we don't care about that. And even if you talk about it, I don't know, it's like it's unreal. But I think it's real because it is here, right? So when you know what my big question is, we know that so many people, parents, teachers, they are suffering for so many different reasons, but it's as if, we are like, everything stands still. This is my feeling, right? And I don't know what to do. So I don't know if I was right to give this this example, but it is one of the examples. It's not the only thing that is happening at the moment, and this is why we have to make it an act of resistance.
Thank you, Joelle. Actually, it's a very telling example.
Yeah.
And it helps to reverse, I guess, some of the questions, the guiding questions for this session, and in the same way that Erin reverse the question of the intersubjectivity. I think that this example helps to reverse the idea of transmission and learning, because there is a transmission of practices that are causing suffering, as you mentioned, to all involved. So I guess there are practices, we are talking about practices of unlearning that will help to transform maybe or disrupt some of these teaching and learning that are currently predominant in a certain sense. Erin, do you want to comment on some of the big questions that Joelle mentioned before the break?
Sure. I'm thinking also that others might want to say something, but maybe that's after the break. Am I understanding correctly?
Yeah, we
Okay.
are planning to have a short break, and
Yes.
then we will invite the participants to debate with us.
Super. Well, I mean, I'm not sure, Joelle, because I'm in Canada, but my understanding is that this is a practice that's been happening in the US for a while because of the gun shootings. And then, I hear about this, that, primary and secondary school teachers are being trained and expected to respond to, in the horrific ways that you describe. And maybe it's also the relative comfort of societies that are not as imbricated in gun culture, that we think that this is not in our backyard. And but I was saying that, not really knowing. So I'm both horrified and not surprised in an awful way. The question, there's something that I puzzle over, and it's, you raised it as well so beautifully. So I think we do have a tendency to think that if something is not forever, it hasn't done its work. And that is perhaps the meaning of an institution. So if something doesn't last, it hasn't done its work. And that's a way that the environment teaches us to not have confidence in the movements in our surround, because they don't continue, they don't persist. So, maybe we have Occupy, but it doesn't work, or maybe because it doesn't work because it didn't last forever. Maybe we have an Arab Spring, you know what I'm talking about. And I've come to think that we have to perhaps be careful not to teach that to each other. That it takes an incredible amount of courage to end things, and to say they have reached the place where they have done their work, and now we end them so that new things can be born. And trust in those practices to do some kind of work. With Sense Lab, we always said that if the work was doing something, it would germinate somewhere without us. And so when I ended Sense Lab in 2019, to the horror of many people I love, I was in no way saying that the practices were over. I was saying that it was time for them to germinate under other conditions. And that's when we started the 3 Ecologies project. So I'm curious about this question, and it's not resolved for me at all. I mean, the question of the institution is very, very complicated, because how the institution plays out in places of privilege is quite different from how it plays out in areas of the world that are not quote unquote democratic, right? So if you look, for example, at Brazil, when Lula made it possible, and it wasn't just Lula, it was years and years and years of Black activists, but when it became possible for Black students to enter into the university, which was only recently, in the last decade and a half, it changed the landscape. And so how do we hold on to this doubleness that the university and other places of learning, that the university is capable of bringing into the world complexity, even while it polices complexity. So how do we think about those parts of the United States that are now radically closing down thought by making it impossible to teach slavery and to teach feminism, to teach sexuality issues, soon to teach neurodiversity? They just haven't figured it out yet that that's a threat. And so it's complicated, isn't it? Because on the one hand, I want to say burn it all down, and on the other hand, I want to say keep it all alive. And maybe we are at a point where we need to be able to think outside of that binary of all or nothing. And that's hard. It's very, very hard. And I don't pretend to know how to do it at all. But I guess I do want to say that I think it's true that many, many, many people are staying in the status quo. But it's also true that many, many, many people aren't. And perhaps the thing to notice is that, unfortunately, many, many people who aren't staying in the status quo have no resources. Often the people who are fighting the hardest are the most precarious. Mm-hmm. And the people who are staying with status quo have wealth and capital and prestige. And so that's something that is very, very much a concern in the kind of work we do, for example, in the Three Ecologies Project, where, for example, we're trying to do many things, but one of the things we're doing is to purchase land and find legal ways of giving the land back to itself so it can't be developed. Not, as somebody said, and I wanted to die just a few days ago, that Erin Manning and Brian Masumi are trying to save the earth 1 acre at a time. That's not what we're trying to do. But what we are trying to do, perhaps, is, in the most modest way, show young people that something is being experimented and that people who have access to capital can do something. And, so we have a cabin up here that is always free. And when people come, maybe there's a little parentheses where something else becomes possible. And like what you're doing, Joelle, which I think is deeply, deeply necessary, which is to say to teachers, we will give you tools to enter the system that might keep you alive. That's very, 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 very important. And I don't think of these things in any kind of competition with each other. I think we need both all the time.
Thank you, Erin. So I would like to invite all of us for a short break, then we can continue in this fascinating debate with all of us. So 5 minutes? Yes.
So we'll come back at 18 past the hour, wherever you are.
So welcome back.
Thank you.
For the short break. And I would like to invite the participants, if someone wants to ask a question. So Hoff, please.
Thanks, Leticia. Well, thank you very much, both of you. Raised so many questions. But I mean, I'd like to pick up on two things, if that's okay with you. One, going back to the very beginning when Joelle talked about constraints and friction. And there's an expression in Brazil, which is where I live and work, which Leticia will know very well. It's called the hole is much deeper. Or in other words, it says we've got to look to the real causes of this. And I was wondering whether we can align cognitivism and the whole evidence-based teaching and looking at science, especially learning sciences now, which has become an explosion all over the world, with neoliberalism or liberalism. And the idea, and which also focuses on measurement, accountability, evaluation, which feeds into teacher education and teaching, which constructs or helps construct neurotypicality and avoid neurodiversity, which then establishes a normative logic in schools and universities, and which then separates living and learning, to use the expression that Erin brought up, but imposes learning, a form of learning that is meant to control living, control living of the excluded and the marginalized. And I think the war example that Joelle produced is a classic example of that. So I think there's a whole network of things here that we need to look at, which are political, economic, social. And I would suggest that the ultimate answer to, it's not a very helpful answer, but the ultimate answer to what Joe's question, what to do, is political action. I mean, it's politics in the broad sense, not party political, but in the broad sense that's going to help resolve this. And a special thing for Erin, if I may, you talked about, it seems to me that you want to establish a kind of relational relation between body and the world, and not one that separates them completely. But then at the same time, you seem to talk about selves, ourselves, as something separable from the world. I'm not sure if I understood that correctly, and not as relational. And I wonder whether aren't selves always relational, and in the sense that they're not just inside us, not even inside our body. Ourselves are also spread out over the environment in an important way. And I wonder whether we can talk about the self as being separate from well, certainly not from the body. I don't think anybody disagrees with that, but separate also from the environment. And that might partially explain why some people are so reluctant to get involved, because their self, their personality, who they are, to a large extent, has been molded by that environment. A lot of which is distorted and oppressive.
Thanks, Half. So, Joelle, Erin, feel free to comment.
I can start if you want. I'll just say a word. I'm not sure how I gave you, thank you for that, Ralph. Couldn't be more in agreement with you. I'm not sure how I gave you the impression about the self. I would never think of the self as anything but relational. So perhaps I just misspoke. I think the self, if there is such a thing, I'm more interested in, it's hard as a philosopher, isn't it? I've written all these books, and it's hard to just speak quickly about something because I tend to approach these questions quite slowly. But I am quite interested in as I said, in the idea of the production of subjectivity, I think, but where subjectivity is not reducible to the human, that is really in a kind of transversality of the three ecologies, the social, the environmental, and the conceptual. And I'm interested in how violence reabsorbs complexity into a self or a subject. I think anxiety does that. I think policing does that, and I think we're seeing the effects of that, particularly in young people who are very much, if I can generalize, in a moment of self-identification. There's a lot of energy and discussion about identification, how a person identifies, sexuality, race, and so on. And while I find it not politically particularly interesting, I recognize that it's a response to the neoliberalism that you began with. And so I would just say that our work with the three ecologies has never been separate from those questions of capital and of economics. We lead actually with those questions, which is why I mentioned the question of property, in ways that sometimes has confounded our left colleagues. Sometimes it can be confounding to speak as much about finance as we do, but we feel that we can't we can't separate out those things. And then the other thing I would say is that I'm one of the thinkers who I'm most learned from. His name is Edouard Glissant, Martinican, a poet and writer, philosopher, I would say, who wrote the beautiful book Poétique de la Relation, Poetics of Relation. He speaks of difference without separability. And I suppose that's the most perfect way of saying it. So what is it to be in difference without separability, which is to say, to recognize that relation leads, but that relation also is not the motor of homogeneity, but heterogeneity. And I think that there are many ways in which we could go back to Varela Maturana's work to find that tendencies of that as well. I move more so through process philosophy, through other orientations, but there's always there's always dialogue that's there. So yes, absolutely, I would absolutely agree with everything that you'd said.
Well, thank you, Ralph. And I have the same feeling. I mean, I understand that it is, as you said, the answer is political, and it reminds me of a video that we watched not so long ago with the students. It was a video of Francisco Varela speaking in a symposium. It was in Amsterdam, and it was in 1990 something, 1990 maybe, and there were like symposium of for each one there was a politician, or was it a somebody of the finance, a scientist, an artist, and a religious person. And when we watched this with the students, we said, wow, I mean, it was back in the 90s, and we've not gone further. I mean, what is happening today? We should probably go on with, keeping this dialogue open. And I agree that the neoliberalism is a real issue, and it's a tough one. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, Ralph. Thank you, Erin and Joelle, for these reflections. Are there any other questions from our participants? In the meanwhile, I have a lot of questions. So while if there are any other questions now, I would like to ask one. We are talking about a lot of ambiguities of the idea itself of the institution. The institution, depending on the context, can be useful or can be detrimental. And even, I would say, the idea of participatory sense-making, because the neoliberalism is counting on that too. We are building together sometimes and reinforcing practices that are causing suffering. Joelle mentioned everyone keep quiet. No one said anything. So in a certain sense, we are participating in this creation of meanings that are causing suffering. So I was wondering, in your practices, in your both Joelle and Erin, what are the criteria that you use to evaluate the meaning that is emerging? If it will be something that it's useful value, something that it's worth to keep going, or no, if we should stop and redirect our practices. What are the criteria that we can use for that?
I'm not sure I understand your question. The criteria we use when we are with the students, right?
Yes,
To
for
decide
example,
if
Erin mentioned quickly that she tried a lot of experiments and some of them failed. And I was wondering why they failed. How did you know that they failed?
Erin, I cannot think now of an experiment that completely failed. I mean, there is, for me, always something that, you know, is good to consider. So there is no complete failure in the projects. I think the main thing for me is discussion. I mean, discussing and mediating, you know, curating the discussions and weighing the things. Because when you say nobody, I mean, when you said, I said that nobody is reacting, not reacting is a reaction, right? So I keep asking people, I mean, and you know, and we need to organize, I think, meetings and discussion on this, because it's a strategy, I mean, to keep people quiet. I don't know, Erin, what would you say?
Yes, I agree with you, Joelle. I don't necessarily think failure is bad. In fact, I hope it's not, because God, we have a lot of it where I work. So I work slightly differently, and it would take a bit of time for me to explain it with enough complexity for it not to sound impossible to understand. But we don't have any consensus based sort of discussions mediating practices in the way we do our work. It is we've created modalities for what we call emergent collectivity. So we don't, for example, SenseLab and 3E have never had any kind of membership. There's no way in and there's no way out. This weekend, for example, up here at 3E, there are 5 people. 3 of them I met yesterday and 2 of them I haven't met yet. That's not unusual. We don't do any media, we don't do any advertising. We assume that if you make it here, you have a reason to be here. We won't ask you what your reason was or who you are, actually, most of the time. We might, you know, it's not like a rule or something, because it's very process driven and project driven. And it isn't in what I would call sort of more typical forms of frontality. The work we do has always operated in what I call minor sociality. So I won't have dinner probably with the people who are here, but we'll probably do some planting together because it's time to plant up the gardens and the greenhouses. We might swim together. I don't know. It's very, it's really project driven. And a classroom is very similar for me. So a classroom will have a proposition. I'll give you one extreme example. So some years ago, this was not a failure. I'll tell you a failure afterwards. But I was starting to teach the first class I taught around questions of Blackness. The reason I started teaching around Blackness and Black studies was because my university refused to hire Black professors. We'd been working for years to try to make it happen, and it wasn't happening. And so I decided I would hire them. And, you know, I consulted lawyers to find out what I was allowed to do with my salary. And for a period of, I guess, 3 years, I paid people to be in the classroom with me. But I was very Black, people to be in the classroom with me. But I was very aware that the classroom would be predominantly white, and that I might also inadvertently reinforce certain ways of thinking that were white. And I really didn't want things to fall into an identitarian schema, which would sort of turn the Black professor into a kind of untouchable presence. So there were lots of issues that I wanted to sort of think about attending to. So I was also aware that in a classroom, it's not uncommon in my context for professors to critique students who don't speak. You know, in the Canadian context, there's a general percentage of the evaluation given to what we call participation, which usually means agreeing with the professor and speaking smart. And I've never felt, I mean, I think that's one of the most dangerous forms of neurotypicality that gets mobilized in the university. So anyway, all this to say, I taught a class called Sounds That Move Us, Sounds That Undo Us. And I set up the room with sound, like little machines for sound, you know, little recording machines, mostly iPods. This was still when they still existed. And on these iPods, there was access to books by Black authors in audible, like, you know, talk, I don't know, sound based, I don't know how to call them. Anyway, so like, for example, Beloved by Toni Morrison, that was an audible book, and so on. And access to YouTube for sound, for music, and so on. And I set up a Google Doc and a projector that allowed you to write if you wanted to in the space. At that period, the classroom had become an environment that was a bit strange. There were many tents in the classroom and tunnels, because students had over years taught me that they really hate having to sit and look at me or look at each other. And so the room was set up in ways that you could sit in a tent or sit in a tunnel. You could also take the class for a walk. You could just, because it was always on Skype. But what was unusual in this particular class is that we all committed to not speak for 4 of the 12 classes, myself included. So you had to choose 4 classes. I didn't know which ones they were. And for those 4 classes, you didn't use your voice. You could turn on any of the recording devices. You could write on the Google Doc. And the idea was that I told the students that I was hopeful that we could learn to speak our third thought, not our first thought. Because in dealing with questions of race and racism, our first thought was probably white, because we were white, most of us. And so that was an example of a very hard teaching situation for me. I constantly felt like I wasn't doing my job. It was hard to stay quiet on the classes that I had opted to be quiet in. But what I found was that I had, of course, you won't be surprised, radically underestimated all that happens when we're not talking. The students opted to continue the class past the 12 weeks. We found that we lost track of time and often stayed longer. By the end of the term, nobody wanted to talk anymore. So, you know, that there was a lot of richness and And this is an example of a kind of emergent collectivity. Something incredible happens, but it doesn't happen through mediation, which is, again, not to speak against it. I'm not trying to speak against anything at all, but to try other ways. An example quickly of a class that was a total failure, I mean, truly, I think the students wanted to kill me, was a class that I taught in 2005 called Affect and the Anthropocene. It was before people knew what the Anthropocene was in a general way. And I wanted to teach a class from the perspective of the earth. So I asked people not to speak in the first person and to try really to think from the perspective of the earth. And the students hated the class. They just hated it. And I heard about it. And about 2/3 through the class, I said to them, look, you're all going to do well because, as you know, I don't give marks. I mean, everybody's going to get an A. So the absolute worst thing you're going to do is 12 times sit in a room where you can't say I. And you can hate me for it. It's okay. But like, could we just do this for 12 weeks? And if in the end we learn nothing, what we will have learned is that we hate not saying I. But I can laugh today. I left the room crying many times. I asked myself whether I was doing anything worthwhile many times. I told myself that even the question of something worthwhile was a neoliberal question, but that didn't make me feel any better. Today, many years later, did the students learn anything? I have no clue. Did I learn something? Yes. So, that's an example.
It's a very good example, Erin. Thank you. It didn't seem like a failure, actually. It's definitely, it was a very difficult experience, but it's maybe problematic to say that's a failure. At the end, everyone learned something. So thank you. Jana, do you have a question?
Yeah, well, in fact, thank you, Leticia. In fact, it was just I'd like to talk about from my experience regarding my professional exercise here as at the National School of Government. So it's a kind of a different context, but just to illustrate a different challenge regarding all of this discussion, because we are dealing with public service and professionals, adults. And but even though we have in Brazil here different kinds of courses for them in order to broaden the sense of, give gender literacy or race or diversity literacy amongst public servants or leaders, we still have the sensation that there are lots of bias and attention that needs to be, worked on. And I think that it's kind of a challenge for us at the National School of Government as well. How can we embody this sense of serving the public while we are serving, just it feels that the professional courses are just aimed for their promotions, or it's kind of a place for their network, but the sense of building something together as public servants in order to serve the public still is missing, In this sense, it's how I feel, in when we talk about education and transmission in this environment. Just to share with you this.
Thank you, Jana. Do you have any comments, Erin, Joelle, about the situation? Hoff asked, which is the country? It's Brazil, right?
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing. Well, I think I don't know. I mean, the National School of Government you're talking about it's a school that teaches at what they training adults to be civil servants, right? Yeah. Well, this is not the field I work in, but I remember a long time ago working with institutions like, the police or the post office in intercultural training, and and it was a kind of experience. And what I remember doing was using, empathy, or trying to ask people to be in the person they should serve's shoes, right? To try and understand how it feels. But I know it's always difficult because so I don't know. I mean, it's maybe I could I don't know. Erin, would you like to add something? No. I'm thinking of what you said, Erin, about emergent collectivity, and with regards to the project, the program I was talking about at the beginning. For example, one of the things we did was never work in the university building. We always work, we always ask, to be hosted free by institution, a cultural institution, but we're not staying inside the university or the schools. So sometimes we work outside in Parisian parks or things like that. And I understand what I mean, I just love the thing about the Anthropocene, not speaking in the third, I mean, not in the first person, because it reminds me of some activities we did, but not on such a long term, like 3 hours. I mean, half a day is already like a big deal. Yeah. So I don't know if, as for this National School of Government, I think it depends, a lot depends on the environment in which you work, actually.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I could add to that. It was, so amazing what you're doing, Joelle, that it's so rare. Often one of the main issues that I'm around is the question of activation. So I'll go back to neurodiversity, and maybe Jana will think about something to say, except I'm sorry, it's hard. The question of activation. So in some modalities of neurodiversity, maybe all of them, not sure, I don't want to generalize, but let's just say, I'm not interested in pathology, but let's just say, just off the top, around ADHD and autism, there are very important issues around activation, which is to say that it's very challenging to reorient a body, which doesn't mean that I don't like the vocabulary of attention as it's mobilized in that context, because it's not at all that there aren't really modalities of attention playing themselves out. But in a neurotypical classroom in a neoliberal world, there is a really remarkable expectation that we're able to trace very clearly what the beginning of a task is and what an end of a task is, and how to how to move into that beginning and how to exit at the end. And if your experience of the world is not so parsed, if it's not so easy to move individually in that way, the park can do it for you. This is the extraordinary thing about the world. The birds, the sound, the wind, the air, the smells can really activate a body. And the irony in the teaching situations that we're in is that we constantly try to do it in the most deactivating of spaces. There's nothing more deactivating than sitting still, like we're doing right now. And you know, we do it because we give in. And I'm not saying there's something wrong. Like I'm enjoying being with you sitting still, but I'm really excited to pull weeds in a few minutes. There's always this kind of movement back and forth that is necessary, I think. And so, but I know, Joelle, how hard it is to do it. I know how hard it is to walk out of the institution, because the institution will punish you for it. And I've been punished. I'm sure you've been punished. And I know what that particular kind of punishment feels like. The other thing I think about, perhaps just to segue the conversation, is that maybe to go back to this question of government modes of teaching, that there's so much that happens sideways. So there's something that happens in the room, like there's something that happens right now. But with all the daydreaming we're doing, and with all the concerns that each one of us has in our daily life, and all the ways in which we're connecting this to other things, I think we can also be more confident that the learning is happening transversally. And so that we could give each other the benefit of the doubt that, you know, that there is more of a role of facilitation than transmission, and that the facilitator is really sort of like a dramaturg, that the facilitator is setting up conditions that may or may not be the best conditions. I mean, you know, that, and by that I mean, you know, we work with a vocabulary of what we call enabling constraint. So constraints are necessary. Some of them, we work very, very hard on generating techniques that we call enabling constraints. But what we found is that an enabling constraint in one context won't necessarily be enabling in another context. And then, you know, things will be difficult. So thinking about how we teach, it seems to me that if in that question we are asking at the very same time, how do we learn, something interesting will happen. But if we're thinking about how do we convey a syllabus, how do we get from the beginning that we've already ascertained is the important place to start to the end that we've already ascertained is the important place to end, we might miss learning. And so the question of the strategic duplicity between both of those is the dance, because many of us are constrained to be in that syllabus. I'm not, but many people are constrained to, you know, meet a requirement of an arc, and how that happens. Yeah.
Thank you, Joelle. Erin, Jana, do you want to add something? Or
No, thank you for all the inputs. Thanks.
thanks. Are there any other questions from our participants? Kira, please.
Hi to everyone. Here I am. Good evening. So thanks for the sharings and the space. Something that go all intertwining with Ralph said and Erin and Joelle about this. And I'm talking from Brazil. I'm doing now a PhD at the university on Federal University of Bahia. Bahia is considered here in Brazil the blackest state of Brazil, with the majority of population is black. And the situation that I'd like to put it here for appreciation is I started to take a master's degree in 2015. And in 2015, I was coming back to the university. When I did my first university, I was really young, also in a federal university. And the landscape, as far as school was related, this was really a white university. And then when I come back years later in 2015, this landscape was totally changed. It was a very big achievement that we go through all this government from left wing, let's say, from Lula and Dilma. And then now, when I was coming to the postgraduate program, there was a problem because the majority of the students were Black, but there were no professors specialized in Black studies. So there was a pushing of the students asking for professors that could guide them in their research. And there was this fighting for 2-3 years until the program decided they would hire professors that were able then to accommodate and to guide and to mentor these kind of projects, this kind of research. And since then, this is 16, 17, now until now, 6-7 years, the number of dissertations and theses talking about Black culture, Black dance, and all the things that are around it really changed. This whole landscape totally changed. And I think this is a very good example of participatory sense making. There was this group of people, they felt like we are not seen, we are not taken in consideration, we have our own research, our own subjects that we want to research, and there is no space here, no one to guide us, and many discussions, many fights with the teachers, with the programs, in meetings, with the collegiate and all that. And then suddenly things start to change. In the landscape now, in this program that I participate, is totally different. They even create a new line of research, because here in Brazil, they have this line of research where you apply to make your postgraduate program. And now they have a Black Studies line of research. And I think this is a great achievement, and goes to this politics that Harfu was talking, and then this participatory sense make between institutions and artists and students and researchers, and something is happening. And I don't know if you guys, Erin and Joelle, have something that goes around this, how, because you said there is no Black professor at your university in Canada. And it's a kind of, Canada is such a migrating country, so many people, so different. And you said also the most of the students are white. So is there any conflict there where the people trying to fight or to achieve something with the university so that this landscape can change a little bit? Thank you.
Yes, thank you for that. I've been part of those, at a distance, and sometimes in Brazil with these changes, and it's been so exciting to watch. I work a lot in Brazil and with Brazilians. Well, yeah, it changed. It did change. I mean, what I told you about that would have been, already 10 years ago, and we do have Black faculty now. It was much too slow, though, and then you reach new problems, which is, for example, not every Black person should have to teach Black studies, so it's a kind of ongoing question. But I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, I think, again, and Joelle said this before, and I think Ralph was saying it too, maybe we're all saying it, we have to fight where we are. Sometimes it's very, very important, the logic of where we are. And I think many of us have been doing that. I think I always think of Brazil when I talk about the university, because, I have for those of you who aren't in Brazil, it's probably hard to understand that half the time the universities don't have water. I mean, the conditions of the university are so extreme in Brazil, and the university is a site of refuge to some degree in Brazil, in a way that has allowed the population to shift. So I always have Brazil in my mind when I'm thinking about the university, and the very big difference between, say, the French university, which has a very different history of meritocracy, but of course has also that Vincennes. I mean, every site is different. But then also there's a danger and sorry to throw this in, but you knew I was going to do it. I just finished a little book called Unsettled, and it's about how in Canada we had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for Indigenous issues, Indigenous life in Canada. It was a decade or so ago. And one of the things that came out of the commission was the need to have more Indigenous folks in the university, which is obvious. It'd be nice to have clean drinking water too, but there are still 25 communities that don't have drinking water. So, my feelings about Truth and Reconciliation Commissions is that they're, to a large part, performative politics and to a small part, change makers. But what has happened in the intervening years, if I put it fast, and there is more nuance to this, is that we have seen hirings of Indigenous people in our universities, which is fantastic. But the university hires what it already knows how to recognize as a bearer of knowledge. And this is true in Brazil as much as it's true in Canada. So to be hired as a Black scholar, to be hired as an Indigenous scholar, is to be recognizable and to have your ways of knowledge already fit to some degree within the ideas that are perpetuated in the university. The effect of that in the Canadian context has been that over the last 5 or 6 years, there's been this incredible process of calling people out as pretendians. So pretendians are people who are pretending they're Indigenous. There are more and more and more of them. Pretendians, in my experience, do excellent work. So it's not even simple. They're often completely engaged in the communities that they're working in. They often feel very strongly the stakes of those Indigenous communities. But for reasons that would not be hard to discern, they think it's easier for them to do that pretending to be Indigenous than being white. And there's simply no question that getting the job is easier if you're Indigenous in a climate that's trying to hire Indigenous people. So these people get called out to a lot of media attention. In my recent book, it's not out yet, but be happy to share it with anybody who's interested. I'm asking the question perhaps more from the angle of capital itself. So what we're seeing in the university sector across the world is this promotion of what in Canada gets called EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion. I think it's a lot of rhetoric and very little practice. Again, nothing is all or nothing, and I'm not in any way saying we shouldn't have equality, diversity, and inclusion. But I think that rhetoric, always moving from the neoliberal machine that holds the university up, produces a certain subject of knowledge, and that subject of knowledge is sought after when the hiring committee comes together. And so I don't think we should be surprised that we're hiring people who are not Indigenous, right? I think we should, because, well, I don't even know if I have to explain that. But if we were to be in the systemic discussion, it would lead us off campus. And I think from my friends in Brazil, I hear something very similar. What are the containment strategies of being given the opportunity to be a Black scholar in Brazil, even at the level of the student or anywhere else in the world? I'm not saying we shouldn't be Black professors, and I'm not saying we shouldn't be Black students, and none of that. I'm just saying that those are the kind of messy tensions that arise when we remain in the logics that are dominant. And when we are, perhaps, just to give a very quick example, if you're a Black scholar and you grew up in a favela, the knowledge base of the people you grew up with will generally not be considered citational. And so in Brazil, you have the very difficult situation of going to African American Black studies because there hasn't been enough literature in Brazil done by Brazilians about the very different history of in the afterlife of slavery. And not everything that's happening in the African American context is relevant to Brazil because of the laws of miscegenation that were different in the two contexts and so on. And so, you know, there's tensions there that I hear in people I work with. And so anyway, yes.
Thank you, Kiran and Erin, for this discussion. We are approaching the end of the session, unfortunately, but I would like to make room for the question of Prashant. I don't know if he gave up the question. I saw that he raised his hand. Maybe Prashant, do you want to ask your question still? Or he's asking in the chat. Maybe I can read for him. In contrast to the classical education model of the teacher dispensing information, is there a discipline an educator can cultivate to be more aware of where the students stand in their current understanding of the topic being studied? Thanks, Prashant. So, Joelle, Erin, do you have any comments?
I was rereading the question, actually. If I understand well, the question is about, oh, somebody has to go. That's Raf. Bye-bye, Raf. Is there a discipline an educator can cultivate? No, I think it's, well, we need to work transdisciplinary. I mean, this is the only solution. I mean, we have, I think we didn't mention that before, but one of the problem is working in silos. I don't know if you say that in English, like we were working in France, especially. This is one of the problem we are having. Like, you know, if you are in history, you cannot, you are not an expert in, I don't know, math or anything else. So you're not entitled to give your opinion, or you're not entitled to. So I think the solution would be to start, you know, working in networking between subjects. This is, I mean, this is the only answer I can see now.
Yes, I completely agree. And I think you know, say I'm teaching and there's a student who I'm pretty sure is not engaged. And then I have that conversation in my head that I was talking about, you know, feeling perhaps entitled to decide whether they're learning or something. I've learned to let that go and to believe that they're learning something and that they will return to me. I want to just give one example, which is very, very moving to me. So I'm working right now, I work with a lot of autistics, including folks who don't speak with their voice. But one of them I'm working with right now in a master's, his name is Julio, is a particular kind of student for me, a new version, because he was excluded from education, but sent to special education. So a lot of the folks I work with would have been excluded from education, but would have grown up in an environment that was full of potential, with people around them who were excited about what they thought. But this person, he and his brother went to special education where they were destroyed, really destroyed. You know, there was physical and mental abuse, and maybe more than that. There was a constant, sort of dread about their future, you know, that they telling them what they wouldn't be able to do and what they would be able to do, and so on. The brothers are differently damaged. The one I'm working with is perhaps less damaged. He's the younger of the two. But when I met Julio, he had very negative things to say about his autism. He was striving for neurotypicality, wanted to know how he could demonstrate it. His dream is to be a high school teacher, and I dream that he will be a high school teacher because I can already feel that he'll make the biggest difference in the world. Julio has come to all of my classes and in a more normative way of understanding has never done the work for them. So what I mean by that is I don't think he does the readings for the course, for the classes that I'm teaching. He sometimes falls asleep. Sometimes he leaves early. He's writing a master's thesis right now, which I'm reading. And the master's thesis takes my breath away. I have to correct it and edit it because he hasn't had the access to language literacy that other people might have had. So many things in this thesis came out of my classes. What he was doing was digesting, metabolizing, thinking, learning. And so he learned with me over these last 3 years that he could ask me a question in the middle of a thought. And he does it in ways that if every student did it, I would go crazy. You know, he writes me on Messenger at 11 o'clock at night. And I allow all of those things to be open because of the context. But he will say, Erin, there was this thing that you were saying in February around this. What was that? And it's so beautiful. And it reminds me that we actually have no idea if someone's learning. And so I think I would like us to have the confidence to presume competence in that way, and to teach ourselves that what we're doing as teachers is helping people feel that they can ask questions of us or of other people.
What a beautiful story to wrap up this session, Erin. Thank you so much. Thank you, Joelle, for this fascinating discussion. And
Yeah, I think
say-
that just to say
Sure.
one word about Erin's example, I think the idea is to believe that they have potential, even if they are different. If you believe, I mean, this is the main teaching for teachers, believing that they have a potential and also leave them, using their own pace, because we don't have the same rhythm and pace. So this is what we need to teach. I mean, this is it. Thank you for this example. It's really, yes, moving.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Joelle. And thank you, Erin, for this session. Thanks, Persian, for this question. And yeah, I would like to invite us all to continue this conversation on Slack. We have a channel, and I have the feeling that we are still digesting everything we learned in this fascinating session. So thank you very much to both of you and for all the participants for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joelle, and thank you, Erin. Thank you, Letitia. And wow, what a breathtaking conversation. And this is really going to be continuing over the next several weeks, months, years, lifetimes. So thank you for this. And just a couple really last...
Just quickly, Joelle, what a pleasure to hear about your work. So thank you, especially to you, for introducing me to Joelle and to her work. It's both fantastic to know what this course is doing, but to know that this kind of thinking is happening. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Erin. And now I want to meet you in flesh. Okay.
We all want to meet both of you in flesh, yes.
Yes, a more embodied session next time.
Exactly.
Yes.
I think we have just a couple last announcements before we close the session, just to invite folks for future events if you'd be interested, because I'm imagining that many of you would be. So our next session, we'll meet back here at the same time next Wednesday for our final themed session of the semester. So we'll be talking about computing differently. AI, robotics, and the future of cognitive science. So we'll see you all back in a week. And you can see the 2 other announcements of some of our other upcoming programs, our podcast, and then we have an evening of contemplative practice coming up too. So thanks again to everyone. Thank you again, Joelle, and thank you again to Erin and Letitia, of course, for beautiful hosting. And have a good rest of your day, everyone, and take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.